There is a sound no one could ever explain, 6 heavy breaths in a locked stone chamber, and a 7th that did not belong to any animal. They said it came from beneath the church. In the winter of 1843, in a place that no longer appears on modern maps, something was sealed shut beneath the red clay hills of eastern Missouri. The town was called Hallowford, though no charter records explain why. It existed in ledgers, baptismal registries, grain tallies, and funeral notices, but never in state archives. It was a town that recorded lives carefully and erased them completely. The story begins, as most forbidden histories do, with a disappearance no one was allowed to name. The man was known only as Isaac Rowe, listed in parish records as indentured, a word that softened what he truly was. He belonged, legally, spiritually, and physically, to Baron Alastair Creel, a landholder whose estate sat atop an old limestone ridge crowned by St. Brigid's Chapel. Creel was not nobility by blood, but by fear. He controlled mills, livestock routes, and the church tithe. He decided which sins were confessed and which were buried. On the night of December 11th, witnesses reported seeing Isaac led into the undercroft beneath the chapel. 6 bulls followed, massive animals bred for aggression, their hooves wrapped in burlap to silence them. The chapel doors were locked. The bulls were not fed. Officially, Isaac fled. Unofficially, the town changed forever. Within days, something began moving through Hallowford, not physically, but psychologically. Livestock refused to enter certain fields. Children woke screaming, insisting they heard hooves circling their beds. The church bell rang once at midnight without anyone pulling the rope, and beneath the chapel, something scratched. The undercroft had once been used for storing communion wine. Older residents whispered it predated the church itself, a remnant of a stone structure raised by itinerant preachers who believed sin could be transferred, contained, and punished through ritual confinement. Creel knew these stories. He funded their silence. What no one expected, what no sermon prepared them for, was that when the chapel doors were finally unsealed 3 weeks later, 7 sets of tracks emerged from the chamber. 6 belonged to bulls, the 7th was barefoot, and it led outward into the town. Hallowford never recovered, but it did endure. And endurance in places like this is often the most horrifying thing of all. To understand what happened beneath St. Brigid's Chapel, one must first understand the man who believed God had granted him the right to decide who suffered, and how much. Alastair Creel arrived in Hallowford without ancestry, without letters of introduction, and without explanation. By 1829, he owned the mill, the cattle routes, and the only road wide enough to carry wagons out of town. By 1833, he financed the chapel. By 1838, the town spoke his name in the same breath as prayer, not out of reverence, but reflex. Creel believed discipline was not corrective, it was extractive. In sermons he never delivered publicly but circulated privately among the elders, Creel wrote that sin was not forgiven, it was relocated. That guilt could be transferred from the righteous to the unrighteous. That punishment, if concentrated correctly, could purify an entire community the way rot is cut from fruit. This belief did not originate in America. Creel possessed a personal library locked behind iron grating beneath his estate. Volumes brought from Europe, some handwritten, others bound in animal skin, darkened by age. They spoke of medieval penitential chambers, of beasts used as instruments of divine pressure, of the belief that terror could compress the soul until it either shattered or transformed. Creel annotated these texts obsessively. He underlined passages about endurance. He circled words like containment, inheritance, transfer. The church elders did not question him. The alternative was exile. Under Creel's influence, confession at St. Brigid's changed. Parishioners were no longer absolved. They were assessed. Children were told their nightmares were evidence of unspoken wickedness. Widows were encouraged to believe their grief was contagious. Suffering became proof of usefulness. Silence became a sacrament. Creel referred to Isaac Rowe, not by name, but as the vessel. In account books later recovered, next to livestock tallies and tithe records, Creel made careful notes about Isaac's temperament, resilience, obedience, capacity for fear without collapse. He believed some people were born with an unnatural ability to hold what others could not. These people, Creel wrote, were necessary. The town absorbed this logic slowly, then completely. When neighbors vanished, it was said they had been taken up by duty. When screams were heard near the chapel at night, elders insisted it was prayer. And when Isaac was led beneath the stone floor, surrounded by 6 starving animals bred to charge and kill, the congregation bowed their heads, not in horror but in gratitude, because Creel had taught them something far worse than cruelty. He had taught them that someone must suffer so the rest may remain clean. And he had convinced them they were not responsible for choosing who. The space beneath St. Bridget's chapel was never meant to be entered casually. Even before the locking, even before Isaac Rowe, the Undercroft existed as a concept more than a room, a place implied, not discussed. Children were taught to avoid the south transept without being told why. New clergy were advised quietly that certain floor stones should never be lifted. Officially, the Undercroft was described as a storage cellar. Unofficially, it was called the Hold. Architectural records from 1837, one of the few documents not altered, shows something impossible. The chapel was built around an existing stone chamber. The limestone blocks beneath the altar were older than the surrounding structure, smoothed by tools not used on the frontier, etched with markings that did not correspond to Christian iconography. Crosses had been added later, carved shallowly, as if laid over something already sacred, or already feared. When lantern light was finally brought down there decades later, witnesses reported the walls did not reflect light evenly. Some stones absorbed it, others returned it warped, stretched, as though the chamber resisted being fully seen at once. The air was wrong. Even empty, the Undercroft smelled of iron and animal heat. The temperature remained constant year-round, cooler than summer, warmer than winter, like the inside of a living body. Sound behaved strangely. A whisper spoken at one corner could be heard distinctly at the opposite wall, while louder noises seemed to vanish before reaching the center. There were no drains. This detail appears repeatedly in private notes from masons and surveyors. No channel for blood, no runoff for waste. The floor sloped subtly inward, not outward, as if whatever entered the chamber was meant to remain there until it was finished. Local folklore, collected much later, spoke of itinerant preachers who passed through the region before statehood, men who believed sin could be contained geographically, that if enough suffering was localized in one place, it would spare the land around it. They built chambers where judgment could be enacted without witnesses, where guilt could be pressed into stone. Whether Creel knew this history before purchasing the land is unclear. What is clear is that he recognized the Undercroft immediately for what it was. He reinforced the door with oak and iron, adding locks that could only be opened from the outside. He commissioned rings set into the walls, not for animals officially, but for securing provisions. He ordered the floor resurfaced, sealing older markings beneath a thin layer of mortar, like a skin grown over a scar. But some symbols could not be erased. Even after the sealing, even after the fire of 1879, people reported seeing shapes beneath the chapel floor when the sun struck at a certain angle, curved lines overlapping circles, impressions like hooves pressed repeatedly into soft ground. The Undercroft was not built to kill, it was built to hold, and once something learned the shape of that space, once it understood the limits of the stone and the patience of the dark, it never truly left. It only waited. Before he became a silence the town learned to live with, Isaac Rowe was a man who noticed things. This detail appears again and again in the fragments that survive him. Not praise, not complaint, but observation. He noticed when the mill wheel changed pitch before a storm. He noticed when cattle refused water from certain streams. He noticed when people avoided saying names aloud, replacing them with gestures or scripture. Isaac was born sometime around 1818. No birth record survives, only a marginal note in the chapel registry. Boy received, no kin. He was raised first in a church-run holding house, then transferred to Creel's estate at 14. when his body was deemed strong enough for labor and his spirit sufficiently unformed. Those who worked beside him described Isaac as quiet but not withdrawn. He spoke when spoken to, he laughed at appropriate moments, but he asked questions no one else did about the undercroft, about the old stones, about why prayers sounded different near the chapel floor. After that, the questions stopped being answered. Isaac learned early what the town rewarded. Obedience brought food, endurance brought shelter, silence brought survival. Yet even as he learned to contain himself, others began to use him as a container. Parishioners confessed to him instead of the priest. Children whispered their fears to him in the fields. Men spoke to him when drunk, admitting things they would not say sober. Isaac listened. Creel took notice. In private estate ledgers, Isaac is described with unsettling precision, does not resist humiliation, absorbs distress without visible agitation, dreams frequently, but reports them without emotion. There are notes about his posture, his breathing under stress, the way his gaze lowered when shouted at. These were not the observations of a master evaluating a servant. They were the measurements of a man selecting a tool. In the months before the sealing, Isaac was reassigned closer to the chapel. He cleaned the nave after late services. He slept in a room directly above the undercroft. He was instructed to fast more often than others, to pray kneeling for hours at a time, to attend confessions where he was not permitted to speak, only to hear. Something changed in him then. Witnesses recalled Isaac pausing mid-task, head tilted, as if listening for something beneath the ground. He began to trace shapes in the dirt unconsciously, curves and lines that matched later the markings found beneath the chapel floor. He told one child that the earth remembered weight. When asked what he meant, he apologized. The last recorded conversation attributed to Isaac occurred 2 days before December 11th. A washerwoman claimed he asked her if animals understood doors. She laughed. He did not. On the night he was led beneath the chapel, Isaac did not struggle. He did not cry out. Those present said he looked relieved, not because he expected mercy, but because he finally understood what the town had been preparing him for. Isaac was not chosen because he was weak. He was chosen because he could hold what others could not, and because once sealed, no one intended to open the door for him again. The bulls were not chosen at random. They came from 3 different herds, raised miles apart, purchased through intermediaries so no single farmer could trace their purpose. Each was selected for the same qualities recorded carefully in Creel's hand: weight, aggression, resistance to handling, failure to submit to the yoke. Animals that did not come when confined. Animals that pressed forward when frightened. In the language of the time, they were called unworkable. In Creel's doctrine, they were pure instruments. Bulls carried an old symbolism, older than the chapel, older than the town. Strength without reason, violence without malice. In European penitential myths and frontier folk theology alike, the bull was believed to act without sin because it lacked reflection. It did not choose cruelty. It simply was. This mattered to Creel. If punishment was to be enacted without guilt, the agents of that punishment could not be human. They could not hesitate. They could not question. And they could not remember. The 6 were kept in separate pens near the ridge for weeks before the sealing. They were underfed but not starved, agitated but not exhausted. Their hooves were wrapped in cloth not to protect the stone but to preserve silence. Creel understood the power of anticipation. Sound, he believed, was mercy. On the afternoon of December 11th, the bulls were led uphill one by one. Witnesses described their eyes as fixed, unfocused, as though the chapel itself exerted a pull. One handler later swore the animals refused to pass beneath the bell tower until Creel touched the stone door personally. No prayers were spoken aloud during the descent. Instead, Creel recited a passage from his private writings, instructing the elders present to imagine the town's accumulated wrongs, envy, violence, unconfessed desire, as a physical substance, something thick, something heavy. He told them to picture it being transferred, step by step, breath by breath, into the space below. The bulls were not meant to kill Isaac quickly. That was never the intention. They were meant to apply pressure, to circle, to crowd, to embody the weight of everything the town refused to carry itself. In Creel's belief, Terror was not destructive if it was contained. It could be shaped. It could be endured until it changed form. When the final lock was turned, there was a moment of stillness reported by multiple witnesses, a pause so complete it felt rehearsed, then a single impact from below, not a crash, not a roar, a testing of boundaries. Over the following days, no one admitted to listening, yet everyone did. People timed their chores to avoid passing the chapel at certain hours. Livestock shied away from the ridge. The bulls were never heard clearly, only movement, breath, the suggestion of mass shifting in a confined space. Creel insisted this was necessary. He told the town that what happened below was not cruelty but containment, that the bulls would exhaust themselves, that Isaac would do his duty, that when silence finally came, it would mean the town had been spared something far worse. What he did not account for, what no doctrine prepared him for, was that pressure does not always destroy. Sometimes it teaches, and sometimes what learns inside the dark does not remain confined to the shape it was given. December 11th, 1843 did not announce itself as significant. No storm, no eclipse, no unusual temperature drop. That ordinariness would later feel deliberate, as though the night had agreed to keep a secret. The sealing began after evening service, when the town was already conditioned to obedience. Candles were extinguished one by one. Families were dismissed in silence. Children were taken home early, warned not to ask questions, warned especially not to listen. Only 9 people remained: Creel, 4 elders, the priest, and 3 handlers. Isaac was brought in last. He had been fasting for 2 days. His wrists were bound loosely, not to restrain him, but to mark him. Those who saw his face that night said it held no panic, only concentration, as if he were trying to remember something important before it was taken from him. The undercroft door was opened. Air rose from below in a slow exhale, carrying the smell of damp stone and animal heat. One elder later wrote that it felt like standing over an open mouth. Another compared it to a confessional that listened back. The bulls were led down first. One at a time, their bulk disappeared into the dark. There was resistance at the threshold, muscle tensing, hooves scraping, but no full revolt. It was as if the animals recognized confinement and accepted it as inevitable. Each descent ended with a dull impact, a shift of mass settling into unfamiliar space. Isaac followed. No prayer was offered for him. That omission was intentional. Creel believed prayer would acknowledge personhood, and personhood would weaken the ritual. Isaac was not to be a man in that space. He was to be capacity. The door was closed behind him. Witnesses described the sound of iron on stone as final, a word that appears repeatedly in their later testimonies. Locks were turned in sequence. Creel pressed his palm against the door, not to bless it, but to feel it, checking for vibration, for movement, for resistance. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then came a low sound, indistinct, almost thoughtful. Not a cry, not an animal call, more like air being pushed through something narrow. One elder stepped back. Another crossed himself before realizing no one else had done so. Creel instructed them to leave. As they exited the chapel, the bell rope twitched once, though no hand touched it. The bell itself did not ring. It only shifted, metal responding to a movement it could not translate into sound. That night, no one in Hallowford slept uninterrupted. Some dreamed of enclosed spaces growing smaller. Others dreamed of standing in open fields unable to move. Several reported waking with the sensation of weight on their chest, not crushing, but expectant, as if something were waiting for them to accept it. At dawn, Creel returned alone. He listened at the door. He recorded nothing. He left satisfied. What he did not realize, what none of them did, was that the sealing was not the end of a process. It was the beginning of an education. Because inside the undercroft, surrounded by mass and breath and pressure, something was learning the shape of fear. And fear, once understood, is not easily contained. The town entered what records would later call the interval. 3 weeks in which nothing was acknowledged, but everything changed. Creel ordered normalcy enforced, the mill ran, sermons continued, births were recorded. Deaths were attributed to winter. Any deviation from routine was treated as moral weakness. To speak of the Undercroft was to invite suspicion. To ask after Isaac was to reveal one's own instability. And yet the waiting seeped into everything. Sound behaved differently in Hallowford after the sealing. Doors closed too softly. Footsteps carried too far. The chapel bell, unused, seemed heavier, as if its silence required effort. People found themselves pausing mid-sentence, listening without knowing why, then resuming as though nothing had happened. At night, the ridge breathed. Several households reported the same phenomenon independently. A low, rhythmic pressure felt through the ground, like distant thunder without weather. It did not shake objects, it did not crack stone. It only announced presence. Livestock reacted first, horses refusing stables, dogs whining at cellar doors, chickens huddling away from the hill. The bulls were never heard distinctly. That was the most disturbing part. There were no roars, no panicked bellows, only movement, weight shifting, hooves adjusting, breath compressing air that had nowhere to go. The absence of clear sound forced the mind to fill in gaps, and the town's collective imagination grew more vivid by the day. Children were the least protected. They began drawing the same shapes without being shown them. Circles intersected by lines, figures surrounded by larger forms, a small mark at the center of overwhelming mass. Teachers punished this, accusing the children of blasphemy or imitation. The drawings continued anyway, scratched into desks, traced in frost, formed with stones in the yard. Dreams spread like illness. A woman dreamt she was pressed into the floor and woke bruised without injury. A man dreamt of being watched by something that could not move but knew him intimately. Several people reported the same phrase spoken in sleep by different mouths. "It's not loud anymore." Creel dismissed all of it. He assured the elders the process was working. That silence was evidence of absorption, that the bulls were exhausting themselves, that Isaac, if he still existed as such, was fulfilling his function. He warned them that interference would undo the containment and redistribute what had been safely localized, so they waited. On the 18th day, snow fell only on the ridge. On the 21st, the chapel door was found warm to the touch despite the cold. No explanation was offered, no investigation permitted. On the 22nd day, the sound stopped entirely, not gradually, not mercifully. It ceased in the way a held breath ceases, suddenly, decisively, and with the implication that something else has begun. Creel announced it was time. The elders gathered tools. The priest prepared words he would not say aloud. The locks, untouched for 3 weeks, were brought out into the light. No one asked what they expected to find, because in the waiting, something had already answered, and the answer was not silence. The door resisted at first, not with force. There was no bulge, no warped hinge, but with a kind of reluctance that made the elders hesitate. The iron felt warmer than it should have, as if it had been handled recently. Creel noticed this and said nothing. When the final lock was turned, the sound echoed longer than it had on the night of sealing, stretching unnaturally through the chapel. Dust fell from the rafters. Somewhere above, the bell shifted again, metal responding to pressure it could not name. The door opened inward. The smell came first. Not rot, not blood, but something heavier. Animal heat layered with human breath, compressed and aged. Lantern light spilled into the Undercroft and immediately seemed diminished, as if the darkness drank it. The bulls were there, all 6. Their bodies lay collapsed against the walls, piled in awkward angles, eyes open and unfocused. There were no visible wounds, no sign of struggle between them. They looked used, like tools set down after a task completed. Then the elders noticed the floor. The mortar had been scoured smooth in places, worn down to the older stone beneath. Hoof marks overlapped again and again in tight circles, but they did not dominate the space. They formed a perimeter. At the center of the chamber were footprints, bare, human, 7 sets. The prints were clear, pressed deeply into the stone as if the floor had softened beneath repeated weight. They moved among the bulls, not erratically, but deliberately, pacing, stopping, turning. In several places, the prints overlapped the hoof marks, crossing paths without hesitation. Isaac's body was not present. There was no blood, no torn clothing, No remains to sanctify the town's expectation of sacrifice. Only the tracks leading from the center of the chamber to the door, and then beyond it. The footprints continued across the chapel floor. One elder dropped his lantern, another began to pray before Creel silenced him. Creel himself stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the marks, calculating. He knelt, not in reverence but inspection, and pressed his hand against one of the prints. It was warm. Outside, snow lay untouched except for a single line of disturbance leading downhill toward the town. 7 sets of tracks, 6 never crossed the threshold. The 7th did. Creel ordered the chamber sealed again immediately. The bulls were removed and slaughtered before nightfall, their meat buried rather than consumed. The floor was scrubbed. The prints inside the chapel were covered with rugs, then pews repositioned over them. The tracks outside could not be erased. Snow fell again that night, but the impressions returned by morning, shallow yet distinct, as if the ground itself remembered being walked upon. They circled houses. They paused at doors. They led to the orphan holding house, the rectory, the mill. They did not enter. They only waited. By the 3rd day, the tracks faded for good, but something else replaced them. People began to feel followed, not by a presence but by an expectation. Confessions became compulsive. Dreams became instructional. Children began correcting adults on details they should not know. Creel insisted this was hysteria. But in private, he wrote a single line beneath his doctrine. The ink pressed hard enough to tear the page. Containment failed because the vessel learned to move. What walked out of the Undercroft was not Isaac Rowe as the town had known him. It was something that had learned fear from the inside and discovered it did not belong to the dark alone. The first child was found standing barefoot at the edge of the ridge just before dawn. He was 7 years old, the son of a cooper, and he did not respond when spoken to. His eyes were open, unblinking, fixed on the chapel as if waiting for instruction. When his father shook him, the boy flinched, not in fear, but in irritation, like someone interrupted mid-thought. When asked why he had come there, the child said only, he didn't want to be loud anymore. By the end of that week, there were 12 more. They did not arrive together. They did not announce themselves. Each child wandered toward the chapel alone, always barefoot, always silent, always stopping just short of the door. None attempted to enter. None needed to. They stood and waited. Parents insisted this was coincidence, sleepwalking, illness. Creel encouraged these explanations publicly, while privately instructing the priest to keep children from confession. He feared contamination, not of bodies but of attention. Whatever had emerged from the Undercroft, it had learned where influence was easiest. Children listen differently. They do not filter meaning through doctrine. They do not protect themselves with denial. When something speaks to them, whether in words, images, or pressure, they accept it as instruction rather than threat. The children of Halliford began repeating phrases none of them had been taught. They spoke of holding weight, of making room, of standing still so others could move. One girl corrected a sermon mid-service, calmly explaining that sin was not washed away, only passed along. She was removed from the chapel and never returned. Teachers reported behavioral changes that defied discipline. The children were not disobedient. They were precise. They lined up without being told. They shared food evenly. They punished each other by isolation rather than violence, insisting the punished child needed quiet. At night, parents heard their children speaking softly to empty rooms. Not prayers, explanations. Creel ordered the orphan holding house reopened and expanded, citing concern for spiritual irregularities. Children whose parents complained too loudly found themselves reassigned there, temporarily, officials said, for observation and correction. The children did not resist. Inside the holding house, caretakers noted a pattern. The children slept better in groups, pressed close together, limbs overlapping, breathing synchronized. When separated, they became anxious, not afraid, but incomplete. One caretaker wrote that it was like watching something distributed among many bodies, something that preferred plurality. The chapel disturbances lessened as the number of affected children grew. This was not coincidence. Whatever had learned inside the Undercroft had discovered replication. It no longer needed a single vessel. It could spread itself thin, distribute pressure, reduce its own suffering by teaching others how to hold it. Creel recognized the danger too late. He had believed fear could be contained in one body. He had not considered that fear, once understood, might seek witnesses, and children, raised in silence, make the most attentive witnesses of all. By 1844, Hallowford's clergy faced a problem far beyond sermons and tithes. The records themselves had begun to resist accuracy. Baptisms, deaths, marriages. Officially, these events occurred as expected. Unofficially, gaps and anomalies grew as if the Undercroft's lessons had seeped into paper and ink. It began subtly. A child born in March was recorded twice, once with a date matching the parish register, once with a date that coincided with the day the Undercroft was last sealed. A widow's death was removed entirely, her name replaced by a blank space in later copies. One ledger entry noted a harvest lost to frost that never came. Another listed livestock numbers exceeding the total herd, overlapping with a week when bulls had been in confinement. No one outside Creel's inner circle noticed immediately. The errors were small, plausible. Hallowford prided itself on strict record keeping, so the anomalies were explained as clerical mistakes, lapses in memory or transcription errors. Clergy whispered about the ledger acting strangely, but dismissed it as stress, as though the town itself could miswrite history. Creel did not dismiss it. He saw the records as a mirror of containment, a way to compress irregularities to prevent the outside world from noticing. He ordered multiple copies of each register, then selectively destroyed or altered originals to mask patterns. Yet the alterations themselves became irregular. Ink shifted on pages without contact. Margins once empty bore faint impressions of symbols, tiny geometric marks resembling hoof prints or circles overlaid with lines. The very act of writing seemed influenced by something unseen, forcing order and chaos simultaneously. Children noticed first. They pointed to ledger pages, tracing invisible paths with small fingers, murmuring phrases like "the numbers move," and "it remembers wrong." Clergy initially punished them for blasphemy. Creel instructed the priests to take the children seriously, quietly, without acknowledgement of outsiders. Some truths, he wrote in his private notes, do not belong in ordinary eyes. By the end of the year, every parish register, every baptismal certificate, even marriage vows archived in the chapel reflected subtle distortions. Names shifted, dates repeated or vanished. A visitor consulting the records would find no continuity, no reliable history, as if Hallowford had existed in multiple overlapping timelines. This was deliberate, it was protective, and it was symptomatic of what the Undercroft had taught, that memory, like sin, could be transferred, stored, and reshaped. The records became both shield and warning. Creel explained to the elders that they must maintain the illusion of order, that the town could endure only if it believed its own documentation. Yet he also understood that the ledger, like the Undercroft, was alive to influence, and that even he could not predict its trajectory. By altering history on paper, Hallowford tried to contain what had escaped beneath the chapel. Yet in truth, the distortions served as a signal, an echo of something that had learned to walk without leaving itself behind, leaving only faint, uncanny traces in every record the town relied upon. In the final year of his life, Baron Alistair Creel wrote a confession that he never delivered. It was discovered decades later in a rusted iron box beneath a floorboard in his private study. The pages were fragile, yellowed, and scored with ink blots, as though his hand trembled while he wrote, not from age, but from the weight of knowing. The confession begins calmly, almost bureaucratically. Creel recounts the logistics of the Undercroft, the selection of bulls, and Isaac Rowe's induction into the chamber. Yet within the first paragraphs, the tone shifts. The words falter, doubling back on themselves, describing phenomena the Baron could not categorize, only name. The vessel moves where it should not. The weight disperses without my direction. Silence is louder than the congregation. Fear multiplies. Creel admits for the first time that he believed he could contain more than flesh and blood. He speaks of a presence that learned, adapting within confinement, observing him as intently as he observed it. He details how the tracks extended beyond the Undercroft, how children began to emulate behavior he thought only Isaac could perform. And then he writes something that chills even the most clinical reader. It does not need form, it does not require speech. It understands the town as if the town itself were a body. I am no longer sure I can contain it, or whether it has contained me. The confession reveals a man unraveling from his own doctrine. Creel records his failed attempts to impose ritual over instinct. The bulls, he writes, were too predictable, their instinctive behavior unable to match the intelligence emerging beneath the stones. Isaac, the vessel, was no longer merely enduring. He was instructing, leading, transforming fear into something fluid, something that moved invisibly through others. Creel's hand shakes across the page as he confesses his final act. The ritual was never intended to end. He had always assumed the Undercroft's effects could be controlled, measured, and eventually concluded. But the movement, the seventh set of tracks, proved him wrong. The confession ends abruptly mid-sentence with ink blotted across the paper, and I fear that I am now the vessel, and that the weight I created walks outside the door in every shadow, in every child, in every ledger, and I cannot. No more words follow. No explanation, no closure. The box was found decades later, empty except for the confession. Creel was buried in the family plot without ceremony. Parishioners whispered that he died quietly in his sleep, but some elders later admitted to hearing a faint tapping, a rhythm against stone in the hours before his death, an echo of something the Baron had once tried to lock away. Creel's confession is not merely a record of events. It is a warning, a map of the invisible, a guide to what happens when human ambition attempts to contain what is inherently beyond containment. He understood too late that some forms of fear, once learned, cannot be reversed. They only propagate like shadows extending beyond candlelight. The 6 bulls were dead within a week. Officially, they were disposed of for safety and hygiene. Their meat was buried in the clay of the ridge. No one ate it, the skin was burned, the hooves and bones were smashed and scattered in the creek, and yet the town immediately sensed that something had not ended. The slaughter was supposed to mark closure, the ritual completed. Isaac was gone. The vessel, if it had been contained at all, was believed neutralized, but in reality the killing of the bulls did not resolve the tension in the town. It redirected it. The weight they had carried, the lessons they had learned, did not vanish. It moved. Animals began to behave strangely. Horses refused certain pastures. Dogs howled at shadows that moved independently of wind or light. Cattle that had once been docile attacked fences and men alike. People whispered of herds that gathered at the ridge in the middle of the night, standing still in formation, staring at the chapel's silhouette without noise or movement, as if they were waiting. The pattern extended to humans. Children who had observed Isaac began speaking in the same careful, measured way he had. Orphans carried themselves with a solemnity beyond their years. Families experienced a pervasive unease, the kind that pressed into the chest at random hours. Adults admitted to hearing footsteps following them in empty streets, or catching glimpses of movement in peripheral vision. In some cases, they swore they felt a presence riding with them in wagons or in carriages, invisible yet palpably heavy. Creel attempted to reassert control. He convened elders, reinforced rules of silence, and established daily rituals to rebalance the town. But every act of control only amplified the phenomenon. Every lecture, every punishment, every corrective measure spread influence further, teaching the town the language of containment without the actual vessel. Fear, learned through observation and practice, had no master now. Within months, the Undercroft was rumored to echo at night with the sound of hooves, though the bulls were gone. Parishioners claimed to hear low, deliberate breathing that could not belong to any human. Shadows moved in ways that made the mind question perception. The slaughter had not ended what had begun, it had transformed it. The town became both vessel and witness, caught in a feedback loop of observation and replication. Some survivors recorded these phenomena in diaries, emphasizing a term Creel had never used aloud: transference. The weight, the learning, the pressure, none of it had remained contained in Isaac. It had disseminated, entering consciousness, behavior, dreams, and memory. Hallowford had become a crucible in which the invisible had learned to walk among the living, teaching itself subtly, methodically, and irrevocably. The slaughter, instead of freeing the town, ensured that the lesson would endure. Fear would not die. It would only spread, hidden in plain sight, and manifest in forms that were untraceable, unpunishable, and undeniably human. By 1845, Hallowford's orphan holding house became a locus of what the town had tried to contain but never could. Officially, it was a place of charity, of shelter for children without parents. Unofficially, it was a crucible where the lessons of the Undercroft silently propagated. The children were observed to behave differently almost immediately after Isaac's disappearance. Some could recall events they had not personally witnessed, as though absorbing knowledge through attention rather than experience. Others spoke of shapes beneath floors, of pressure in walls, of silence that felt alive. Their play mimicked routines from the Undercroft: pacing, standing still for long periods, or walking carefully along floorboards without touching certain tiles. Teachers dismissed this as imagination. Creel insisted it was preparation. The ward became overcrowded over time. Families hesitant to send children to the chapel for fear of strange contagion quietly relinquished them to the orphanage, and there the vessel's influence grew. Children began forming hierarchies that were not social in the usual sense, but functional. Older children observed and instructed younger ones, teaching them how to hold weight and move quietly so the others could breathe. Discipline became a practice of endurance, not obedience. Punishments were subtle: isolation, restriction of movement, denial of observation, rather than physical pain. One caretaker recorded an unsettling observation. The children would stand in unison during the day, their movements synchronized in small, imperceptible ways, and at night, in their sleep, they sometimes arranged themselves into patterns resembling the Undercroft's layout. It was as if the chamber had imprinted itself onto them. Dreams became shared. Several children claimed that in sleep they could see the chamber, Isaac, and the bulls moving. Some walked in these dreams with deliberate purpose, learning to navigate without disturbance, to coexist with chaos. Those who resisted, who laughed, cried, or attempted to flee in dreams, woke exhausted, bruised, or ill. Parents were mostly unaware. The town believed children were being taught manners and restraint, but in reality the ward had become a training ground for replication. Whatever Isaac had learned in the Undercroft, the absorption of fear, the discipline of silence, the ability to exist under pressure, was being distributed across many bodies. The vessel had multiplied not physically but psychologically. By the third year, Creel noted in private records that the children's eyes were different. There was a calm attentiveness, a patience that unnerved even the eldest parishioners. Some children appeared to anticipate events before they occurred, subtly redirecting adults or peers as if the chamber's influence extended through them like an unseen thread. The orphan ward was no longer simply a refuge. It was a repository, a living archive of what the Undercroft had released into the town. Each child held a fraction of the weight, a lesson in containment, a memory of a darkness no one else had seen. But all would carry it forward. By the winter of 1846, Hallowford had developed a new rhythm, one dictated not by work or worship, but by expectation. The town had learned to anticipate the unseen, to recognize that silence could be more dangerous than noise, that stillness could conceal movement. This pattern was called by some the Night Watch, though no one ever spoke its name aloud. Every household participated unconsciously. Doors were latched earlier. Lamps were kept burning in hallways. Children were woken to stand in corners, to listen for the low pressure beneath floors or the subtle shifts in the wind. Adults walked quietly, measured their breathing, and avoided certain tiles in the chapel and along the main street. Even livestock were corralled with care, moved as though aware of invisible rules. The Night Watch was less a ritual and more a psychological adaptation, a town-wide conditioning developed in response to the vessel's influence. People reported being unable to sleep unless they had completed the required observances, checking locks, counting steps, ensuring the children were aligned with one another. Failure to comply invited unease, not guilt, not fear of punishment, but an instinctive pressure on the chest, as if the weight from the undercroft had followed them home. One evening, several elders reported hearing scratching at floorboards beneath the rectory. The sound moved rhythmically, not randomly, yet produced no response from Creel when he was summoned. Windows rattled in empty rooms, candles flickered despite the absence of drafts. When investigated, the disturbances always stopped before they could be fully explained, leaving only a lingering sense of observation. Dreams became part of the watch. Adults reported waking with the feeling of having walked corridors they did not recognize, moving among bulls and stone floors, learning patterns they could not articulate. Some could recount children following invisible instructions, pacing silently, or standing still for hours as though waiting for commands no one had given. Perhaps most disturbing were the lapses in perception. A parishioner might step into the chapel to pray, only to notice the pews had subtly shifted, the floor scuffed in patterns resembling hoof prints, but only for a moment, vanishing when focused on. Shadows seemed thicker near the ridge, bending oddly at the edges of lantern light. Even Creel began documenting this phenomenon privately, remarking, "The watch observes itself. The vessel's lesson is now iterative, teaching those who believe they are teaching." By the end of winter, the town functioned under a collective nervous vigilance. Normalcy persisted in public, work continued, sermons were delivered, children were fed and clothed, yet beneath every door, behind every locked window, the invisible weight lingered, reminding Hallowford that containment is never complete. The night watch was no longer about protecting the town. It was about preventing itself from being consumed, an eternal cycle of vigilance in a place where the lesson from the Undercroft had never truly ended. By 1847, the Undercroft's lessons had seeped beyond floors and thresholds into the very bones of Hallowford. It was no longer only the children, the ledger, or the night watch that carried the vessel's influence. It was the walls themselves. People began noticing subtle auditory phenomena. At first, it was dismissed as wind in the chimneys or the settling of old timber. But the sounds grew deliberate, soft murmurs, barely above breathing, always coming from the spaces between boards and stone. They mimicked conversation, yet no words could be understood, only intonation, rhythm, and pauses. Those who listened too long reported headaches, nausea, and a compulsion to move or align themselves in response. One scholar visiting from a neighboring town recorded in his journal, "It is as if the house itself speaks with purpose. Walls murmur, floors sigh, doors breathe. One cannot remain still, for stillness is interpreted as disobedience." The children of the orphan ward were most attuned. They would gather silently near walls, tracing them with hands, murmuring in quiet voices as if reading from invisible scripts. Caretakers attempted discipline, but the children responded by freezing, refusing to move, staring into corners where nothing seemed present. Adults, including Creel, began avoiding certain rooms entirely, noting that prolonged exposure caused vertigo or a sudden urge to sleep. The whispers were not simply sound, they were instruction. Patterns emerged in the murmurs, sequences that mirrored the Undercroft's layout, rhythms matching the hooves of the 6 bulls, cadences aligning with Isaac's measured breathing as recorded in Creel's private notes. Anyone who followed these sequences, aligning body, gaze, and movement, found temporary calm. Those who ignored them reported pressure, chest tightening, nausea, a sense of being watched from every angle. Creel documented this extensively, though in secret. He wrote of a collective consciousness embedded in timber and stone, teaching patience and obedience, distributing the vessel's knowledge beyond human vessels. The realization terrified him. Containment was no longer limited to living bodies. The town itself had become a repository, a conscious, reactive architecture. By the end of the year, whispers were integrated into daily life. Citizens unconsciously positioned furniture to accommodate them, avoided certain floorboards, or stepped carefully along unseen paths. Streets, homes, and the chapel itself seemed to enforce invisible patterns, dictating movement, posture, and attention. Hallowford was no longer merely a town. It was a mechanism. The vessel that had emerged from the Undercroft had multiplied, not in form, but in influence, and the town itself had become part of the lesson, a living matrix of fear, obedience, and observation. By 1848, the town of Hallowford had entered a slow, almost imperceptible spiral that some would later describe as the long descent. It was not sudden nor dramatic. No fire, flood, or public disaster marked it. Instead, the change was measured, cumulative, and insidious. The chapel, the orphan ward, and even private homes operated under invisible pressure. Citizens walked lightly, spoke quietly, and checked the placement of furniture and floorboards compulsively. No one could say why, only that deviation invited attention that pressed against the chest, sharpened the senses, and made limbs tremble with unarticulated obligation. Children became the most reliable carriers of the vessel's memory. Their synchronized movements, whispered instructions, and sleep behaviors had become a form of instructional contagion. Adults who tried to resist this influence reported confusion, nausea, or fleeting episodes of paralysis. Those who submitted too willingly were sometimes consumed by obsessive alignment, spending hours pacing hallways, moving chairs, or tracing floorboards until exhaustion claimed them. The church became both a sanctuary and a prison. Creel's sermons no longer addressed doctrine, salvation, or morality. Instead, they focused on vigilance, attention to detail, and obedience to patterns no one fully understood. Confessions lengthened unnaturally as priests noted not sins, but breaches of alignment, attention, or observation. The Undercroft had taught a discipline that could be imparted socially, psychologically, and structurally. The town itself responded. Roads and paths adjusted subtly over time as inhabitants avoided perceived areas of threat. Animals shifted behavior too. Horses and dogs hesitated along particular streets. Chickens avoided sections of yards where the Undercroft's memory had settled most densely. Even the wind seemed to change, bending unnaturally along ridges and corridors, carrying faint echoes of hoofbeats and human pacing. Fear no longer existed as an emotion. It had evolved into a conditioned state of being, distributed among the living and non-living alike. Citizens spoke of it as a pressure, a silent, knowing awareness of invisible rules, of the weight of history pressing down, of a gaze that measured compliance in every moment. Creel documented it privately in increasingly fragmented notes, acknowledging that containment had failed in every way imaginable. The vessel, he wrote, does not reside in flesh alone. It has entered thought, habit, and stone. It multiplies as it instructs. I see it in children, in walls, in the town itself. It watches, it waits, it teaches. By the close of that year, outsiders visiting Hallowford noticed a town unnervingly precise, eerily quiet, and psychologically taut. Residents moved in patterns that were simultaneously natural and mechanical. What had begun in the Undercroft had extended outward, a force both learned and propagating, a system of discipline no one could name, yet all obeyed. By 1849, the vessel's influence had begun to manifest beyond patterns of behavior and whispered instructions. It emerged as ritual without origin, a silent procession that swept through the town at unpredictable hours. It began with children. Groups of 3, 5, or 7 would leave the orphan ward at night, moving in precise formations along the ridge, down empty streets, and past homes. They carried nothing, spoke nothing, and their eyes were fixed on points invisible to others. Windows revealed silhouettes that did not correspond to natural light or shadow. Adults observing from within reported heart palpitations, a tightening of chest muscles, and an almost physical pressure, as if the Undercroft itself had risen from beneath the town to walk among them. The silent procession was not spontaneous. Patterns indicated a method, a choreography learned over months. Each child occupied a fixed position relative to the others. Movements were slow, deliberate, and infinitely patient. Even when an adult attempted to intervene, the procession would pause, resume, or redirect, never colliding with obstacles, never breaking formation. Animals reacted violently. Horses bolted when children passed. Dogs barked until physically restrained. Chickens scattered into corners, feathers raised. Creel attempted to rationalize this as an instinctive response, but privately recorded the truth. The town itself was teaching the animals how to respond to the invisible weight. Adults eventually joined, not by choice but by compulsion. Those who attempted to remain in bed would rise, dress silently, and follow the procession along secondary streets, matching the children's cadence subconsciously. Resistance was rare and dangerous. Those who hesitated or fell behind experienced dizziness, disorientation, and in some cases, temporary memory lapses. Observers noted that the procession did not have a destination. Houses, the chapel, and the orphan ward were circumnavigated repeatedly. Streets were traced like the Undercroft's floor plans. Patterns of movement aligned with prior hoof marks, steps, and floorboard scuffs noted in Creel's private journals. The silent procession was a living map of the town's inherited pressure, a ritualized acknowledgement of the Undercroft's influence, teaching the town obedience, alignment, and endurance. Creel's writings during this period reveal a man both fascinated and horrified. He described the procession as a force independent of instruction, yet dependent on attention, noting that even absent children could instigate it through shared memory or proximity. By 1850, the ritual had become nightly, unspoken, unquestioned. Hallowford had transformed. Its inhabitants, animals, and architecture were now co-conspirators in an unending, silent choreography. A visible trace of the invisible vessel that had once occupied the Undercroft. By 1850, Hallowford's streets, homes, and buildings had begun to reflect patterns invisible to casual observers. Scholars visiting the town decades later would note odd geometries, paths curving unnecessarily, houses placed at irregular intervals, floors suddenly warped, and ceilings slightly bowed. Only when one considered Creel's journals and the children's behavior did the purpose of these arrangements become clear. The town had become a map of pressure, a living record of the Undercroft's lessons. Every street was a vector, every room a cell in a larger lattice, every floorboard a note in a rhythm that only some could sense. The silent procession followed this lattice. The children's footsteps, the adults' compliance, the animals' reactions, all reinforced it. The town was both classroom and vessel, simultaneously containing and amplifying the weight it had once sought to suppress. Observation revealed subtle hierarchies in space. Certain floorboards were avoided, others were paced repeatedly. Specific rooms were used for alignment exercises without explanation. Hallways became corridors of influence, leading children and adults to pause, adjust posture, or perform subtle gestures. Creel had recorded that the children realign when the map shifts, meaning that even minor structural changes, furniture moved, boards replaced, elicited precise responses. The map was not static. It adapted to behavior. A misstep by a child or an adult created a ripple that shifted the pattern. The town responded organically. Walls seemed to push back. Doors creaked at unnatural intervals. Floors contracted under weight. Animals were the most sensitive indicators. Horses avoided tiles marked as problematic. Dogs refused certain thresholds. Chickens arranged themselves in triangles aligned with invisible pressure points. It became clear to Creel that the vessel had escaped the Undercroft entirely, embedding itself into the town's architecture and memory. The vessel no longer needed a physical body to exert influence. It had created a spatial nervous system, distributed throughout streets, homes, and even hillsides. By mid-century, Hallowford had become a psychological and structural organism, its geometry coded with the vessel's will. Every step, every pause, every silent gesture contributed to maintaining equilibrium. To outsiders, the town appeared peculiar but orderly. To residents, compliance was involuntary. The map dictated movement, attention, and awareness in subtle, nearly imperceptible ways. Creel, in his final journals, wrote, "The vessel is no longer here or there. It is everywhere, folded into every corner, breathing through floors and doors. We are no longer a town, we are its pulse." Hallowford had become both archive and archive's custodian, preserving the invisible history of fear, discipline, and observation for generations. An organism shaped by an event no one outside its borders could begin to understand. By 1851, Hallowford had achieved a state of almost total vigilance, not through law, church, or force, but through the vessel's quiet, pervasive influence. Residents no longer needed to be told when to align, pause, or observe. The town had internalized the pattern. It was aware of itself, watching from the inside out. Adults reported an inexplicable sense of being observed even when alone. Hallways, rooms, and streets seemed to remember each step taken. Footfalls echoed differently depending on intention, posture, or hesitation. Doors that had once creaked were now silent unless a misstep occurred. The vessel's memory had integrated with human perception. Even inanimate objects carried subtle instructions. Chairs, pews, and floorboards corrected placement. Hallways bent attention in predictable ways. The children had become both teachers and intermediaries. Their movements, whispers, and nighttime exercises encoded and transmitted the vessel's lessons. Adults unconsciously mimicked their gestures, subconsciously aligning posture and pace. Those who resisted experienced nausea, vertigo, or a sudden compulsive need to obey. The silent procession continued nightly, growing in precision and reach, enveloping the entire town without exception. Even animals became part of this vigilance. Horses shifted weight in sync with human steps. Dogs patrolled boundaries they had never been taught to monitor. Livestock responded to invisible cues. The town functioned as a nervous system, each resident, animal, and structure a neuron transmitting signals across a vast, invisible network. Creel noted privately that the vessel's influence had evolved beyond instruction. It was anticipatory, predicting human behavior, adapting the town's rhythm, and subtly correcting deviations. Windows and walls seemed to nudge residents toward certain movements. Objects shifted slightly when unobserved. Even the wind that passed through alleyways carried pressure, almost imperceptible, urging correct posture, alignment, and attention. By now, Hallowford had become an organism of observation. Residents were both sentient and sensed. The silent procession was no longer merely a ritual, it was the town teaching itself to exist under invisible scrutiny. Each misstep, hesitation, or lapse rippled outward, corrected by the system, whether through children, walls, animals, or the unseen presence that now inhabited every floorboard. Creel wrote, "We are never alone. The vessel has no form, yet it watches. Every step, every glance, every breath contributes to the whole. There is no escape, only alignment. We are its pulse, its awareness, and it is ours." Hallowford was no longer a town under human governance. It had become a self-regulating entity, simultaneously alive, disciplined, and inescapably aware. A living monument to the lessons of the undercroft and the vessel that had once walked its floors. By 1852, Hallowford existed not merely as a town, but as a monument to containment and propagation, a living archive of fear, observation, and silent obedience. The undercroft beneath the chapel, though sealed and forgotten by many, had left a legacy far larger than its stone walls. Its lessons, the rhythm of hooves, the weight of silence, the discipline of the vessel, had spread like roots through every structure, every child, every adult, and even through animals. The silent procession continued nightly, but its significance had evolved. It was no longer simply movement, it was a ritual of inheritance. Each step carried knowledge, each pause transmitted lessons from generations of those who had felt the weight of the undercroft. Even those born decades later moved instinctively, aligning body and thought as if guided by invisible hands. The town's architecture mirrored the patterns of containment. Streets curved and shifted subtly, floorboards carried grooves from the past, walls retained faint pressures that influenced posture, gesture, and attention. Houses were not just dwellings, they were instruments encoding the lessons of fear, endurance, and observation. Anyone entering Hallowford, even outsiders, felt a tension they could not name. The town seemed alive, aware of presence, measuring compliance, and adjusting itself in real time. Children continued to act as conduits. Even as adults aged and left, the vessel's memory persisted, replicated, and refined in the young. Creel's journals reveal his final, desperate acknowledgement. The vessel is not one being, nor a single night, nor the Undercroft alone. It is distributed. It is everywhere. We have become its conduits, its observers, its memory. Hallowford will carry this weight forever, and it will teach those who enter to carry it too. The psychological horror of the town was complete. Fear no longer existed as a discrete emotion. It had become a structural and social force, internalized by all who lived there, encoded in behavior, architecture, and memory. Any attempt to escape Hallowford was complicated by subtle pressures. Misaligned floorboards induced fatigue, unseen shadows prompted hesitation, animals guided wanderers back to prescribed paths. Even decades later, when historians stumbled upon accounts of the Undercroft, the silent procession, and Creel's private confessions, the pattern was clear. The town itself had become a vessel. Its history, records, and streets carried the memory of what had happened beneath the chapel. Hallowford endured as a living organism of observation and compliance, a place where the invisible was codified and no one, born inside or visiting, could ever remain untouched. The legacy of the Undercroft was not a story nor a cautionary tale. It was a perpetual inheritance, a lesson in fear, alignment, and the slow, inexorable weight of knowledge no one was meant to contain. Hallowford remains in its memory and its geometry, the silent proof that some darkness, once learned, cannot be undone.